Thank you, Your Honor. And if it's all right, I'll remain seated so I can access my computer if the court needs to know.
That's fine. If you need to get out, let me know.
Will do, thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention on this case. Now, the state gets another closing statement called a rebuttal. The defense does not. That's the way our system is set up because they have the burden, so this will be my only chance to talk to you. And what I want to, I think, focus on and what the evidence has showed in this case is that within a couple hours of the shooting, approximately, Joshua Aide was in custody, and detectives from the Oshkosh Police Department had traveled down to the city of Oregon, placed him under arrest, and essentially at that point, as far as law enforcement was concerned, this case was essentially closed. You had heard Detective Artis' testimony, you had heard the audio, you told him you were being charged, 1 count of first-degree intentional homicide, 2 counts of attempted homicide. I'm not going to give you the honor and privilege, or the pleasure and privilege of knowing who it was you killed. I mean, the decision was made and the investigation was essentially over that night within a couple hours on what really turned out to be a rather complicated case. And what this was, and what the evidence has shown here, is the only continued investigation really by law enforcement was a somewhat coordinated effort to make the evidence in this case fix the narrative that was given by their determined victims, Rebecca Borkowski and John Miller. For example, John Miller's statement. The first statement, the statement that he gave that night in the hospital was that he was standing in front of the Tahoe's radiator when Josh came up, and that is where Josh had shot him. And then he gave a later statement through that exhibit that you were shown just in closing arguments by the state on that photograph where he had drawn like the footsteps or he marked with a marker his route. Well, that's because 10 days later, after approximately, I believe it was August 14th, they had discovered, Detective Robinson had discovered this bullet jacket down in a crack in the cement at Rebecca Borkowski's driveway. Now, 10 days later, this is after the driveway had been scrubbed clean, vehicles moved out, numerous personnel in and out of there. Apparently, Sharon Morano had cleaned the driveway, scrubbed it, conceivably swept it. They had the state and the police just landed on, that must be in that crack where this bullet jacket flew and landed. And instead of even considering that this bullet jacket was probably swept into that crack when the cement was cleaned, it almost seems obvious, but instead, as Detective Hinkey said, something to the effect of John Miller's statements just wasn't making sense. Well, why wasn't it making sense? Because it wasn't true. It was even inconsistent, the first version with Rebecca, when he said that he was standing in front of the Tahoe and Rebecca was standing over by the passenger side wheel well, where Rebecca said they were both standing together in front of the Tahoe. Why don't they match? Because neither one of them is actually true. The second example that we saw in the course of the trial of law enforcement taking the evidence in this case, or attempting to make it fit the narrative of Rebecca and John, was from Officer Cody Rucan. And they're in evidence as his 2 police reports that he, for some reason, wrote in this case, specifically the second one. His first police report, this is Defense Exhibit 22, And he testified about it, that it reflected that Rebecca responded to verbal commands when he first had contact with her. Then in December, he files a second police report that said she was unconscious and unresponsive. Well, we know from the initial arriving officer that got there before Corey Boot Camp that she was in fact conscious and responsive and answering the officers as they called out to her. The first report, he talked about looking through her hair for a gunshot wound. The second report, he searched the area around her person for weapons and evidence that could have been ditched or placed near her. That first report was written on August 5th, 2020, the second, December 19th, 2020. Well, what happened in between that time frame? Rebecca showed up with this missing firearm. And when I asked the officer, who told you to write this second report, to essentially change this narrative, never did get a clear answer out of that. Multiple searches, multiple officers searched through, pursuant to a search warrant, trained officers, trained in conducting searches, searched through Rebecca Borkowski's house that night, and they found 4 weapons, looking for weapons and other evidence of a crime, and they found 4 of them. And yet, after Rebecca turns over her 380, there was really no explanation. I think it even went as far as Detective Fry said he wasn't sure if anybody even searched that room, the living room. Detective Robertson testified he knows there was officers searching the downstairs, he was upstairs, and his impressions of the search that they were doing a thorough search. Now, you saw Officer Nick Kowalski's body camera when he was in there looking for the dog. He had approached, as he was walking around looking for the dog, pretty much instinctively what police officers do. I just think it's in their DNA and in their training to look under things, to look for things. And he moved the pillow aside, and the bag opened up, and I asked him, were you able to look in there? And he confirmed he did, and he saw nothing. Despite how the state tried to spin it on cross-examination and get him to speculate, did you see anything in that bag that was relevant? He said no. Had you seen a gun? Is that something you would have reported? Yes. So, where did Rebecca's gun go that night? And I told you, there's going to be some questions that we can't answer, and the burden is not on us to answer them. And one reason why we don't know is nobody bothered to investigate or even question what happened to this other gun. We know from the body camera of Officer Scott, the responding officer, that when he arrived, and you could see John Miller running back from across the street. He wasn't kneeling in the road, he wasn't coming down the sidewalk, he was running across the street. Where was he coming from? We don't know. Did he run back to the scene after going to Daniel Schrader's house and pick up the gun and take it across the road? We don't know. Was it looked into? No. Did anybody look for blood droplets out in the streets? Well, certainly there would have been. And where they led to? No. Said nobody was interested in investigating anything further that didn't fit the narrative that was already provided by John Miller and Rebecca Borkowski. Nobody asked John Miller where he was coming from the other side of the road. John Miller testified, well, you saw a cross-examination in the video. John Miller, with 13 prior criminal convictions, had told the police on August 4th that he had just met those people yesterday. You saw that on the video, which would have been August 3rd. He told Detective Hinkey later, and she testified, and I asked her about, that he had been friends with these people for years. Why lie? What are you covering up? Two different versions he gave of where he was shot. Both differ and regarding where Rebecca Kowski says she was standing. What we do know about John Miller, and that came out in my questioning Julie Gruettner, was that he became upset when Joshua Aide called him on the 4th and was questioning his credentials. And we know later, after that phone call, as he apparently sat and stewed on Josh Aide's audacity, he became, quote, royally pissed off, end quote. And what did, at that point, was that when the decision was made to go down that day and lure Josh down there and kill him? We don't know. Again, this wasn't thoroughly investigated, but we know the evidence is showing that as that afternoon went on, John Miller is the one that got royally pissed off, became extremely upset. We're not asking you to speculate that or infer that from anything. You were provided that testimony. And at some point after that, it appears that the decision was made to have Rebecca call Josh and tell him that they were going to be changing the radiator that day. One that Josh, that you now know, repeatedly asked her not to do. If not, allow him to come and pick it up and do it, to have a certified mechanic do it. That was done through a phone call. They texted him the address. And at some point then they proceeded down up to Oshkosh, and John Miller acknowledged that he had a knife. And this was to repair a radiator that apparently had a hairline crack in it that hadn't been a problem since it was discovered in November of 2019. So knowing that Josh Aide did not want him doing this, yet they decided that day, after they were all quite upset, John Miller clearly, was upset, they lured him up there under that auspice. And we know Rebecca strategically placed firearms around her property. We saw her text message to that effect as well. We know that from her testimony, she put her cell phone in her Jeep after they had arrived at her residence, and that she kept in her vehicle that Oshkosh defense bag that she had carried. Inside that bag, she had items from her car. And inside that bag was located by the officers a Smith & Wesson magazine and the ammunition. This is where she kept that Smith & Wesson .380 pistol that was missing from the scene and then later turned in after apparently first asking that she get the other guns back. And this gun, as she acknowledged in her testimony, forgetting to initially tell the police about. Though she offered up at first that it was a Ruger, but in fact now we know it was a Smith & Wesson. So how does Sharon Morgano fit in all this? You saw her testimony. I mean, she clearly appeared uncomfortable. There's no doubt about that, and I have no doubt she was anything other than a pawn in this. However, she said she found the gun in a place where we know law enforcement officers looked, if not once, certainly by Officer Koleski twice during the search of the residence, and it was not there. But she said she found it while she was looking for Rebecca's wallet. But on cross-examination, she acknowledged that Rebecca didn't know she was there and couldn't say who, if anybody, had asked her to go get her wallet. So that doesn't make any sense. The state asks you to believe that it's improbable that Josh could have shot John Miller on the right side of his face as he's facing him, but they forget that Josh is left-handed. And instead they ask you to believe him that he shot him from behind as he's coming around chasing him, in their words, around the Ford Focus. But that still doesn't make any sense. He'd be shot in the back of the head, and it still doesn't put the casing landing on its own where they wanted to have landed in that crack in the cement, approximately 10 days after there had been thorough cleaning of that property. It's the first time I don't think there's any evidence other than an argument's not evidence, but the state said that Josh chased John Miller around the vehicle and shot him. Nothing supports that. As to evidence of intent, really what the state offers, it makes no sense at all. Josh is just before this, retired from the Marine Corps, successfully employed as an engineer, honored the discharge from the Corps, employed as an engineer. He had really no appreciable contact with Rebecca since their breakup in March. Months had gone on. All he wanted to do was maintain some type of friendly relations with her, months without any issues whatsoever. But we do know. So that leaves the question, well, what's the motive on either side? Because it makes no sense at all that Josh would just drive up there and shoot these three in the head and leave. And the state attacks our motive for why they would want to, Rebecca, John, and Jim, lure Josh up there to kill him. Well, we do know that Rebecca was a beneficiary on his life insurance policy, as well as his work. But again, the state failed, or the law enforcement absolutely failed to look into any of this and thoroughly investigate this case, but more importantly, whether you want to, and if I could have the counsel, please. Whether you want to say it was just sloppy police work regarding the searches, Detective Fry, I believe it was, that said that they couldn't even confirm if somebody had searched inside the recycle bin or the garbage bin or not. There's absolutely nothing sloppy about the absolute failure to even look into Nurse Nikki's statement to law enforcement at the hospital that night. The only thing that they gathered from it is that this was just buried. And playing defense exhibit number 19 from the admitted portion beginning at 3:25.
So basically, Dad,
take the pill. No, I just got off the phone with Mom.
So when did you guys hear that story?
So I just got off the phone with her mom.
holy shit.
She just got off the phone with Mom.
So it must have went through the ear.
Wow.
I've seen them where they hit the skull, they don't go in, they just guys back. So she's tender right about here. Yeah.
She's swollen.
Well, there was just someone saying, these might have been kind of.
We're not off the phone with Mom.
I'm assuming,
They wanted me to.
That was nothing.
She immediately started crying.
Vision.
She died.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Nikki. I'm nervous. Like, she started freaking out. I'm like, wait. I said, I have your dog here. Did she get shot? I'm like, I haven't told her anything yet. And she goes, I said, no, she's here. You know, what happened? Did her die? And right away, she's like, what happened? Did her die? She's like, where's my husband? I said, I don't know who your husband is. Well, my husband was on his way to Asheville to come kill someone.
I don't know.
He didn't. I found out, but I had told her and I didn't tell the mom anything. So, I don't know what all transpired. I told her, I have no idea what she was seeing, and she said, my husband, another in-law was there, or like best friend was
Yeah,
there.
it's a family friend, and that's who's at the original.
Okay, so,
It's his family friend.
yes, she said, my girlfriend's husband, and my husband were on their way there to kill
John
ex-boyfriend.
and Jim must have been.
Stopping at 5 minutes, 16 seconds. No matter how the district attorney tried to throw Nurse Nikki, she finally responded, I know what I heard. And it's unequivocal that Julie, after being initially told that Rebecca is in the hospital, her first reaction was she shot. Not was she in an accident or anything like that. And then she unequivocally said her husband and her girlfriend's husband, John, were on their way to Oshkosh to kill him. There is no getting around that. There is no excuse for when the nurse testified that she told this to these officers, including the tall, skinny detective at the hospital that night, that absolutely nothing was done about this. No questions were ever asked of Julie. No questions were ever asked of Rebecca. No questions were ever asked of John. And this circles back around to the start of my closing argument, that the only work that was done in this case by law enforcement was to cram everything into the narrative that they had been provided by the people that they deemed the victims. Period. Up to this point, nobody would listen to Nurse Nicole Fields. Thank God you are here today, and that we ask that you will. Up to today, nobody cared about anything that Nurse Nicole Fields had to say, at all. We ask today that you do. The states tried to do everything they could to distract from this, to keep you from hearing it. They want you to look over here back to 2016 to 2018 and text messages and Josh is an abuser and all of this. But nothing can distract you from Nurse Nicole's testimony and the unimpeachable truth that Jim Gruettner and John Miller drove to Oshkosh that night to kill Joshua Aide. And the only thing that fits the evidence and makes any sense whatsoever is Joshua Aide walked into an ambush. And the only thing, as I stated in my opening statement, that Joshua Aide is guilty of is being the survivor. That is why he's not law enforcement's designated victim. And I ask that you find him not guilty. Thank you.